What if I told you that everything we think we know about human civilization could be completely wrong? What if the story we've been taught about our ancestors, about the rise of cities and writing and complex society, is missing an entire chapter that stretches back not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of years into the past? Right now, as you're watching this video, beneath your feet and under the oceans that cover most of our planet, there might be traces of civilization so ancient that they make the pyramids look like yesterday's construction project. We're talking about societies that could have risen and fallen when our species was supposedly nothing more than scattered bands of hunter-gatherers, scraping by in a world we barely understood. But here's where it gets interesting. What if that entire narrative is built on a foundation that's starting to crack? What if the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, but simply evidence of time's incredible power to erase? Today, we're going to dive deep into one of the most controversial questions in archaeology and anthropology. Could advanced civilizations have existed 100,000 years ago, long before anything we recognize as organized society? And if they did exist, what would that discovery do to everything we think we know about human history? This isn't just some wild speculation or fantasy. This is about real archaeological anomalies, genetic mysteries, and scientific discoveries that don't quite fit the timeline we've all learned in school. By the end of this series, you'll understand why some researchers are quietly asking whether we've been looking at human history completely backwards. Let me start with a number that should blow your mind. 100,000 years. Try to really grasp what that means. If you took every single year of recorded human history, from the earliest writing systems in Mesopotamia all the way to right now, and then multiplied that entire span by 20, you'd finally reach 100,000 years. That's not just ancient. That's almost incomprehensibly deep time. And here's what makes this number so significant. Modern humans, people who looked exactly like us and had brains identical to ours, have been walking this planet for at least 200,000 years. That means for half of our species' existence, we supposedly accomplished almost nothing that would qualify as civilization. No cities, no monuments, no organized societies, just small groups wandering around with stone tools. Does that seem right to you? Does it make sense that beings with our intelligence and creativity would spend 100,000 years doing essentially the same things, generation after generation, without any major breakthroughs or innovations? The standard story goes like this. For the vast majority of human existence, we lived as hunter-gatherers in small mobile groups. Then, around 10,000 years ago, something magical happened. We figured out agriculture. Suddenly, we could settle down, build permanent communities, and everything we recognize as civilization exploded into existence within just a few thousand years. It's a neat story. It's clean and simple and easy to understand. But what if it's wrong? What if the real story is that human civilization has risen and fallen multiple times across our species' history? What if there have been cycles of complexity and collapse that stretch back far beyond anything we've discovered? What if the civilizations we know about are just the most recent attempts, the ones that happened to leave behind traces that could survive until modern archaeology came along to find them? Think about this for a moment. When archaeologists study the past, they're working with fragments. A piece of pottery here, some stone tools there, maybe the foundation of a building if they're really lucky. But here's the problem with fragments. They can only tell us about the things that were built to last, or that got incredibly lucky and survived in exactly the right conditions. Wood rots, textiles decay, metals corrode, even stone, given enough time and the right conditions, can crumble into dust. A city built from organic materials could vanish completely in just a few centuries. Now imagine what 100,000 years could do to erase evidence of human achievement. But it gets worse. The deeper you go back in time, the fewer archaeological sites exist. For the past few thousand years, we can map human settlements across entire continents. Go back 10,000 years, and we're dealing with scattered villages. But go back 100,000 years, and we're working with maybe a handful of sites across the entire planet, most of them incomplete and heavily eroded. This creates what I call the preservation paradox. The absence of evidence from deep prehistory might not mean our ancestors lived simple lives. It might just mean that time has been incredibly effective at erasing the evidence of whatever they actually accomplished. And here's where things get really interesting. We're starting to find cracks in the traditional timeline. Discoveries that don't quite fit the story we've been telling ourselves about human development. Take stone tools, for example. In the last few decades, archaeologists have uncovered blades and points from sites that are supposed to be way too old for such sophisticated craftsmanship. We're talking about tools that show standardization, symmetry, and techniques that suggest not just skill, but organized knowledge passed down through generations. Some of these artifacts are being dated to periods when humans were supposedly barely capable of making crude stone flakes. Or consider symbolic behavior. We've found shell beads in Africa and the Middle East that are over 75,000 years old. Pieces of ochre with deliberate engravings. Stone fragments with markings that might represent abstract thought or even early symbolic systems. This isn't the behavior of simple survival-focused groups. This is evidence of culture, of meaning-making, of societies complex enough to create objects that served no practical survival purpose. Then there are the migration patterns that keep pushing our timelines further and further back. For decades, scientists believed humans first left Africa around 6,000 years ago. But new discoveries keep appearing that suggest human presence in Asia, Australia, and even the Americas much earlier than anyone expected. Australia is particularly interesting because it was never connected to any other landmass, even during the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age. To reach Australia 65,000 years ago, humans had to cross multiple stretches of open ocean. That's not accidental. That requires watercraft, navigation skills, and the kind of planning and cooperation that we usually associate with much more recent civilizations. What does it mean that humans were capable of ocean voyaging tens of thousands of years before we thought they could organize anything more complex? than hunting parties? And speaking of the ocean, here's something that should keep you up at night. More than 70% of Earth's surface is covered by water, and the vast majority of it has never been explored. During the ice ages, when sea levels were much lower, vast areas of land that are now underwater were exposed and available for human settlement. If you were an early human looking for the best place to build a community, where would you go? You'd head for the coastlines, where food was abundant, travel was easier, and resources were plentiful. But here's the problem. Those ancient coastlines are now hundreds of feet underwater, covered by sediment that's been accumulating for tens of thousands of years. Any evidence of coastal civilizations from 100,000 years ago wouldn't just be hidden. It would be buried under layers of mud and debris at the bottom of the ocean in places we've never even thought to look. This brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of this whole question. We're starting to find anomalies underwater, structures that some researchers believe show signs of human construction, dating back far longer than our accepted timeline allows. Off the coast of Japan, there's the site called Yonaguni that features what appear to be massive stone terraces, steps, and geometric shapes. Some argue these are natural geological formations. Others insist the features are too precise, too ordered to be anything but artificial. The debate continues, but the very existence of such formations raises questions about what else might be hidden beneath the waves. Similar underwater anomalies have been reported off the coasts of India, in the Mediterranean, and in Southeast Asia. In each case, the challenge is interpretation. How do you distinguish between natural geology and ancient construction when you're working hundreds of feet underwater with limited visibility and equipment? But here's what makes this particularly fascinating. These aren't isolated cases. Reports of underwater structures that don't fit natural patterns keep appearing from different parts of the world. Even if most of them turn out to be natural formations, what if even one of them represents something our timeline can't account for? The implications would be staggering. It would mean that human history is far more complex than we've assumed. It would suggest that the story of civilization isn't a straight line from simple to complex, but a series of rises and falls that stretch back far deeper into the past than we've been willing to consider. This is just the beginning of what we're going to explore in this series. We're going to look at genetic evidence that suggests human populations were far more complex and interconnected in the distant past than the archaeological record shows. We're going to examine artifacts that seem to be out of place in time and consider whether our methods of dating and interpretation might be missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. We're going to dive into the myths and oral traditions that cultures around the world have preserved for thousands of years. Stories of great floods, lost cities, and vanished civilizations that might contain kernels of real historical memory. And we're going to grapple with the fundamental question of what we mean when we use the word civilization at all. Does it require writing and monumental architecture? Or could there have been forms of human organization and achievement that we wouldn't recognize because they don't match our expectations? The journey we're about to take will challenge everything you think you know about human history. It will make you question the assumptions we've built our understanding of the past on, and consider possibilities that mainstream archaeology has been reluctant to explore. Because here's the thing, if we're wrong about this, if there really were advanced civilizations 100,000 years ago, then the story of humanity is far older, far more complex, and far more remarkable than we've ever imagined. But before we dive deeper into the evidence, we need to understand just how stacked the deck is against finding proof of ancient civilizations. The challenges aren't just significant, they're almost insurmountable. And that's exactly what makes the few anomalies we do find so compelling. Let's talk about the enemy that's been working against us for 100,000 years. Time itself. Time is the great eraser, the ultimate destroyer of human achievement. It doesn't care how magnificent your civilization was, how advanced your technology, or how proud your monuments. Given enough time, it will reduce everything to dust and scatter that dust to the wind. Consider what happens to our modern world if we just disappeared tomorrow. Within decades, wooden structures would rot and collapse, steel would rust and crumble, concrete would crack and be overtaken by vegetation. Even our greatest achievements, our skyscrapers and highways and dams, would be gone within centuries. And that's with materials specifically engineered for durability. Now imagine a civilization from 100,000 years ago, built with whatever materials were available then. Even if they had developed impressive construction techniques, even if they built on a massive scale, what would be left after so much time? The honest answer is almost nothing. Maybe some scattered stone blocks that could easily be mistaken for natural formations. Perhaps some metal artifacts buried so deep and corroded so badly that we'd never recognize them as artificial. Possibly some genetic traces in isolated populations or fragments of memory preserved in oral traditions that have been transformed beyond recognition. This is why the search for ancient civilizations is like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle when 99% of the pieces have been lost, and half of the remaining pieces might not even belong to the puzzle you think you're working on. But there's another layer to this problem that makes it even more complex. It's not just that evidence gets destroyed over time. It's that the kind of evidence we're trained to look for might not be the right kind at all. When archaeologists search for signs of civilization, they look for specific markers: written language, monumental architecture, metalworking, pottery, urban centers with clear signs of planning and organization. These are the signatures of the civilizations we know about, so we assume they're the signatures of all civilizations. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if there were forms of human organization and achievement that operated completely differently from anything in our historical experience? What if there were civilizations that built primarily with organic materials that have long since decayed? What if there were societies that chose not to create permanent monuments, but instead focused on knowledge, art, or spiritual achievements that leave no archaeological trace? What if there were cultures that developed sophisticated technologies we wouldn't recognize because they followed completely different principles from our own? This isn't wild speculation. Even in the historical period, We know of highly advanced societies that left surprisingly little archaeological evidence. The Indus Valley civilization supported large cities with sophisticated drainage systems and standardized weights and measures. But their script remains undeciphered, and much of their material culture has vanished. If we can lose so much knowledge about a civilization that existed just 4,000 years ago, in a region that's been continuously inhabited and studied, what might we have lost from periods 10 or 20 times more distant? The more you think about these limitations, the more you realize that absence of evidence really isn't evidence of absence. It's just evidence that we're working with an incredibly incomplete record, trying to reconstruct a vast and complex story from a handful of fragments that happen to survive against impossible odds. And this brings us to something that should fundamentally change how we think about human potential in the deep past. The fragments we do have, the few pieces of evidence that managed to survive 100,000 years of erosion, decay, and geological chaos, consistently show that early humans were far more capable than our traditional timeline suggests. Every time we find evidence of symbolic thinking, artistic expression, or technological sophistication from periods that are supposed to be too early for such developments, it forces us to push our estimates of human capability further back in time. But here's the crucial point. These discoveries probably represent just the tiniest fraction of what actually existed. If we're finding shell beads and engraved ochre from 75,000 years ago, what does that tell us about the full range of cultural expression that existed then? If we're finding sophisticated stone tools from periods when humans were supposedly barely capable of basic tool making, what does that suggest about the technologies they might have developed that we'll never find evidence for? If humans were capable of ocean voyaging 65,000 years ago, navigating by stars and currents to reach Australia, what other achievements in exploration, trade, and cultural exchange might they have accomplished that have been completely erased by time? The pattern is consistent and striking. Every major breakthrough in our understanding of deep human history reveals greater complexity, earlier innovation, and more sophisticated behavior than we previously thought possible. The trend isn't toward simpler explanations. It's toward recognizing that our ancestors were far more capable than we've given them credit for. This creates a fascinating paradox in how we interpret the evidence. When we find something that fits our expectations about the past, we accept it without much question. But when we find something that challenges those expectations, something that suggests earlier or more advanced development than our timeline allows, we become incredibly skeptical. That skepticism isn't necessarily wrong. Extraordinary claims do require extraordinary evidence, and the history of archaeology is littered with mistakes, misinterpretations, and outright hoaxes. But the pattern of resistance to evidence that doesn't fit established models is worth examining. Consider how long it took for the scientific community to accept that humans reached the Americas earlier than the Clovis culture. For decades, Any evidence suggesting earlier human presence was dismissed, explained away, or simply ignored. Sites that clearly showed human occupation thousands of years before the accepted timeline were rejected by mainstream archaeology until the evidence became so overwhelming that the old model had to be abandoned. The same thing happened with evidence of interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals. For years, the idea was considered impossible despite mounting genetic evidence. It wasn't until DNA analysis became so sophisticated that the results couldn't be ignored that the scientific consensus finally shifted. These cases show us something important about how knowledge advances in archaeology and anthropology. It's not just about finding evidence. It's about accumulating enough evidence that challenges the existing framework to force a paradigm shift. And that process can take decades, even when the evidence is relatively clear and recent. Now imagine trying to establish evidence for civilizations that existed 100,000 years ago. The evidence would be fragmentary, ambiguous, and open to multiple interpretations. The timeline being challenged isn't off by a few thousand years, but by tens of thousands. The implications aren't just about adjusting our understanding of human migration or technological development, but about fundamentally rethinking the entire trajectory of human civilization. Under these circumstances, it's not surprising that mainstream archaeology approaches such claims with extreme caution. The burden of proof is enormous, and the evidence, almost by definition, is going to be insufficient to meet that burden definitively. But that doesn't mean the question isn't worth asking. In fact, it might be one of the most important questions we can ask about our species' history. Because if we're wrong about this, if there really were complex civilizations in the deep past, then everything we think we know about human development, about the relationship between technology and society, about the trajectory of progress itself, needs to be reconsidered. The implications extend far beyond archaeology. If human civilization is much older than we think, if it has risen and fallen multiple times across our species' history, then our entire understanding of sustainability, social organization, and long-term cultural survival becomes a different conversation entirely. We're not just talking about rewriting history textbooks. We're talking about fundamentally changing how we see ourselves as a species, how we understand our capabilities and our limitations, and how we think about our future on this planet. This is why the search for evidence of ancient civilizations matters so much, even when that evidence is fragmentary and controversial. It's not just about satisfying curiosity about the past. It's about understanding what humans are capable of, what we've achieved before, and what we might achieve again. The story we're uncovering isn't just about lost civilizations. It's about lost possibilities, forgotten experiments in human organization and achievement that might hold keys to challenges we're facing today. As we continue this exploration, we're going to examine the specific pieces of evidence that suggest our timeline might be incomplete. We're going to look at genetic mysteries that hint at complex population structures in the deep past. We're going to consider artifacts and structures that don't fit our accepted chronology. and we're going to explore the myths and legends that cultures around the world have preserved, stories that might contain memories of real historical events. But most importantly, we're going to approach this investigation with both open minds and critical thinking, because the truth about human civilization, whatever it turns out to be, is far too important to be distorted by either blind skepticism or wishful thinking. The journey into deep time is just beginning, and the discoveries waiting for us there might change everything we thought we knew about who we are and where we came from. The evidence starts to get really interesting when we look at what's hiding in our own DNA. While archaeologists dig through fragments of stone and bone, geneticists have been uncovering a completely different kind of historical record, one that's written in the genetic code of every person alive today. And what they're finding doesn't match the simple story we've been told about human development, not even close. Here's something that should make you pause. When scientists first started analyzing human DNA, they expected to find evidence of a single lineage spreading out from Africa in neat, orderly waves. What they actually found was far more complex. Our genetic history is full of mixing, interbreeding, and interactions between different groups of humans, some of whom were quite different from us. We now know that as our ancestors spread across the world, they encountered other human species, Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in parts of Asia, and probably other groups we haven't even identified yet. These weren't brief, hostile encounters. These were sustained interactions that included interbreeding and cultural exchange. Most people today carry genetic material from these ancient encounters. If you're of European or Asian descent, you probably have Neanderthal DNA in your cells right now. If your ancestors came from certain parts of Asia or Oceania, you likely carry Denisovan genes as well. But here's where it gets really mysterious. Geneticists have identified what they call ghost lineages. These are fragments of DNA that clearly come from human groups that have never been found in the fossil record. Entire populations have left no bones, no artifacts, no archaeological trace where entire civilizations of humans, that means. Their physical record, but people who lived, thrived, and contributed to our genetic heritage, but who completely that we only know whatsoever. Think about who have been completely erased from the on in our DNA. If they existed because of genetic analysis, what does whole populations can vanish, so that tell us about how much of human history has been lost? The genetic evidence also reveals something else that's fascinating. Human populations in the deep past weren't isolated groups slowly spreading across empty continents. They were dynamic, interconnected networks with complex patterns of separation and reconnection that stretched across vast distances. Some studies suggest that groups of humans were separated for long periods, developing independently, and then later came back into contact and mixed again. Over the span of 100,000 years, this could have happened multiple times, allowing different populations to experiment with different forms of social organization, technology, and culture. This genetic mixing wasn't just about biology. When populations come together, they also exchange ideas, technologies, and knowledge. If these cycles of separation and reconnection were happening throughout human history, It means that innovations developed by one group could have spread far more widely than the archaeological record suggests. Imagine a coastal civilization that developed sophisticated navigation techniques 100,000 years ago. Even if their settlements were later submerged by rising seas, their knowledge could have been carried by traders and explorers to other regions, influencing the development of societies thousands of miles away. We might be seeing echoes of these lost connections in the similarities between cultures that supposedly developed independently. The prevalence of flood myths around the world, for instance, might not just be about shared experiences of natural disasters. It might reflect actual historical memories of civilizations that were destroyed when the sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. The genetic evidence also suggests that human migration patterns were far more complex than we once thought. People weren't just moving in one direction, slowly spreading from Africa to populate empty continents. They were moving back and forth, establishing trade networks, sharing technologies, and maintaining connections across vast distances. This kind of long-distance interaction requires organization, planning, and social structures sophisticated enough to coordinate complex activities across multiple generations. It's not the behavior of simple hunter-gatherer bands. It's the behavior of societies with the capacity for long-term thinking and large-scale coordination. But perhaps the most intriguing genetic mystery involves what we don't find in the DNA record. If there were large, complex civilizations in the deep past, we might expect to see genetic signatures of population bottlenecks, periods when human numbers crashed due to disasters or conflicts. Some geneticists argue that they do see evidence of such bottlenecks, periods when human populations dropped dramatically before recovering. These events could represent natural disasters that wiped out major population centers, wars between competing civilizations, or environmental changes that made certain regions uninhabitable. The timing of some of these genetic bottlenecks is particularly interesting. They seem to cluster around periods when we know major environmental changes were occurring, times when sea levels were rising or falling, when climate zones were shifting, when entire ecosystems were being transformed. If there were coastal civilizations during the Ice Age, they would have faced an existential crisis as the ice melted and sea levels rose. Entire regions where millions of people might have lived would have been gradually submerged. The survivors would have been forced to migrate inland, potentially coming into conflict with existing populations or struggling to adapt to completely different environments. This scenario could explain both the genetic evidence of population mixing and the absence of archaeological evidence from coastal regions. The civilizations were there, but they're now under hundreds of feet of water and sediment. The genetic record also reveals something else that's crucial to understanding deep human history. The capacity for symbolic thinking, abstract reasoning, and complex social organization appears to be much older than we once believed. Studies of brain development and cognitive capacities suggest that anatomically modern humans 100,000 years ago had essentially the same mental capabilities we have today. They could think abstractly, plan for the future, create art and music, develop complex languages, and organize sophisticated social systems. If the hardware for civilization was already in place 100,000 years ago, why assume it took so long for the software to develop? Why assume that humans with our cognitive abilities would spend tens of thousands